Hello, welcome. Today we're going to mark an essay. We're going to use the Azim Premji University philosophy rubric. You can get that rubric on Moodle or by emailing one of the faculty, but sometimes it's useful to see the marking going on, the rubric applied in practice. You get to find out what all of those words in the rubric mean exactly. So here's our essay. What is the strongest objection to utilitarianism? Can it be overcome? And here's what the student did with it. The strongest objection to utilitarianism is that it is alienating. Fantastic! Already I know the answer to part of the question. This essay shows that the most prominent attempts to avoid the problem of alienation fail. Wonderful! I've also got the beginnings of an answer to the second part of the question. It's very clear. It's very crisp. There's no fluff here. Railton's sophisticated utilitarianism avoids forms of alienation, which blah, 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 blah. And here, in these three sentences, we have an outline of the argument for this clear thesis. And the outline is really clear. Even better, we can see how, as you go through the outline, the essay is going to be structured. The student has listed each section and said what's going to happen in that section. So in section 3 we're going to show this, in section 2 we're going to show this, and section 1 is going to be introducing these two ideas. This conclusion, it's short, it's only 5 and a bit lines, but everything in there has a purpose. It's doing exactly the right job. You've got a clear, controversial thesis, exciting one too. We've got an argument that's outlined for it, and at the same time we're outlining the essay to help the reader. You don't want anything else. This is perfect. Good work. And as a marker, by the way, when you're reading this sort of thing, you go, oh, okay, that's really exciting. I want to see what's going on. This is a sort of essay where you're kind of excited to read the rest of it, and you're already probably thinking, this might be a really, really good essay. It's good to have the marker think that way. So put some serious work into your introductions. Here, we've got a subheading, Utilitarianism and the Problem of Alienation. It's a good subheading because not only has it got a number, but it tells us what's in that section. And actually, as you look at the other subheadings, and just reading the subheadings, we can get a sense of what the essay is going to be saying. So, utilitarianism and the problem of alienation, Railton's response to this sort of alienation is temporarily successful. Railton's response to that sort of alienation fails. And then we got the conclusion. That's great. I can see the bare bones of the argument just from the subheadings. Very helpful. You don't need to put subheadings in, but you need to be easily able to put subheadings in. It needs to be obvious where the subheadings would go. You want to have very clearly in your mind what part of the essay is doing what job. Here we've got the introduction to utilitarianism, and it's pretty good. The writing's pretty sharp, you're saying pretty precisely what you mean. This jargon actually has been borrowed from Sen, Amartya Sen, and Amartya Sen means something slightly different, but this is still a reasonable thing you might mean by welfarism. The students define it in their own words, but that's fine. Here we've got a grammatical error, is, and actually this essay's got quite a few grammatical errors. This one's not obscuring the meaning in any way. I know what the person means perfectly, so I'm not too worried about it. Just read your essay aloud before you submit it. We'll pick up this sort of silly mistake. Here, we've got something quite ingenious, actually. A little bit of fancy footwork done in 2 short sentences. This essay is going to discuss only this simple form of utilitarianism, and the arguments will apply to more complex forms such as rule utilitarianism with some adjustments. So the student's going to say, I'm only looking at this simple form of utilitarianism, don't trouble me with anything else. I know that there's other stuff, and I know that my arguments I might have to change a bit to deal with that other stuff, but I'm not interested in that in this essay. They're narrowing down what their essay looks at, and they're being very clear that they're doing so for a good reason. Right? They're saying, I don't need to talk about that stuff, and they're being clear that they're stipulating this. They're not arguing it. All of that's excellent. It's difficult to do. You've got to be really careful that when you're saying, I'm not going to talk about that stuff, that you don't talk about it enough that it seems like you're arguing about it, but arguing badly for it. This is a sort of stipulation. I'm only talking about simple utilitarianism, and it will also apply to rule utilitarianism, but I'm not going to argue for that. It's clearly a stipulation. You want to make it clearly a stipulation. If it starts to look like an argument, if it's this long, it's going to be a bad argument, most likely. So, clever little couple of sentences, and here we've got a pretty standard definition of naive utilitarianism or simple utilitarianism. And we've got an illustration of it. All of this is pretty darn concise. We've broken down utilitarianism in 125 words. Neat. There aren't really any excess words there, other than the is. There's not much I'd cut. Good work. And here, we've got something really interesting going on. We've got two forms of alienation. This shows that the student is grappled with the ideas themselves, and this is probably the student's own ideas. They don't actually say it. It might be really nice to say, and by the way, this is not standard in the literature, but this is my idea. I might be able to just have a few words to mark out that this is my idea, not an idea I've got from the literature. But it doesn't matter, because it's actually pretty clear. We've got two different forms of alienation, and they're clearly distinguished. They're explained, they're illustrated with a concrete example. And then this is also explained and illustrated with a concrete example. Now, it's not perfect. In particular, the definitions have got this slight element of redundancy. So we define alienation from people as using utilitarianism to do something, but then later on we talk about using utilitarianism leads to alienation from people. So there's a sort of redundancy built in here. You get the same redundancy here. And there's another redundancy which is more subtle. It's even worse than a redundancy, actually. It's a mistake. Here we have a moral idea. So we're alienated from people when we ought to be connected from, but they're not. But then we also claim down here that alienation is bad if we ought to be connected to people. Now, that's a confusion. The person's kind of fluffed it up a bit. It's not an obvious confusion. It took me a couple of minutes to notice it. But it just takes away slightly from the clarity that the person needs to just work a little bit more to get this absolutely precise. They've done a pretty good job, though. I mean, it's not bad at all. This paragraph's good. It's showing that the student knows the literature. The student's pointing out that in the literature, standardly, you think of this as something completely different from this, and you come up with a different solution to both problems. But I don't think you can do that. And this paragraph argues very persuasively and very clearly that actually you have to treat them as the same problem, or more precisely, if you haven't solved this problem, then you haven't solved this problem. So you should deal with them together. It shows a good knowledge of the literature by firstly understanding that they're treated separately, by citing the literature just very briefly. There's no fuss here. The person's not going out of their way to show that they know the literature. They don't have to. What's happened here is that the student genuinely understands the literature, and so they genuinely understand that what they're doing might be quite confusing, and they're saying, hey, this might be confusing, but actually the way I'm doing it is the right way to do it. It's an absolutely outstanding paragraph. It's really clear. It's good work. And here, this is just the paragraph which explains and illustrates this and shows that it's a problem for utilitarianism. That's what's going on here. Okay, good work. So here we're moving on to the meat of the essay. This first section is really just introducing the ideas. There's some nice, interesting stuff going on here. But until this stuff is used in an argument, it's not getting credit yet. Here we're going to, in this section, look at Railton, who's going to give us a response to the problem that arises from this sort of alienation. And here's the response. Railton argues that only a naive... wrong date. Mistake there. I'm not going to penalise that too much because the big bibliography has the correct date, so they've just got the wrong date up here. But that's okay, Not great, but not a huge problem. Railton argues that only a naive utilitarian is vulnerable to the problem of alienation. A more sophisticated utilitarian will not think like a utilitarian and will so not suffer from alienation. Now that's correct, but it's not exactly clear. Fortunately, the student knows this, and they say, more precisely distinguish between these two things, and this distinction is really rather well done. It's not an easy distinction, the distinction between practical action guidance and the criterion of the right, but it's done here with clarity. And then Railton's point is rephrased using these new tools that the students introduced. Grammatical error. Should be a full stop there. Again, that's not obscuring the meaning, so that's not a worry. Good work overall here. And again, it's quite concise. There's 147 words to introduce Railton's objection, which he spends a whole paper on. It really does capture the important parts, the parts that are important for this argument. And here we've got an argument showing that Railton's response works, at least to an extent. Pretty bad spelling, but the content's good. And here we've got a really fantastically clever argument which arose from, it seems like a student saw a problem. They saw, well, look, I've said that Railton's going to fail to respond to this, and I've also said that if he fails to this, and I've also said that if he fails to respond to this, he'll fail to respond to this, so I can't say that he succeeds in responding to this. The students noticed this problem. They put in this paragraph saying, okay, well, if Railton's successfully responded to this, provided he's successfully responded to this. You don't have to follow the details of that, but they're being reflective. They're trying to find problems in their own argument, and that's just clear from the way that they're writing the essay. So that's excellent work. Railton's response to alienation from project, the second form of alienation, we're going to argue in this section that fails. And this section is really where the essay stands out. We've got, first, a good argument that Railton fails to respond to this sort of alienation. Then the person sat down and thought, well, what could Railton say in response to that? How could Railton get out of that? And they come up with really quite an ingenious thing. This is something Railton could say. It's not something Railton did say, but it's something Railton could say, and they make it sound very plausible. If you're in an essay and you come up with an argument against your own argument, and you make that sound very plausible, that's good philosophy. And this is good philosophy, except for the terrible spelling. But again, that's not going to detract from the meaning, so we're not going to be overly worried about it. It just shows a lack of care. Excuse me. Here we've got an objection to the response to the objection to the problem with utilitarianism. So we've got quite a lot of depth going on here already. We've got, in fact, in total, we're going to have, I think, 8 layers of depth. An argument, an objection to that argument, a response to that objection, an objection to that response to that objection, a response to that objection to that response to that objection, an objection to that response to that objection to that response to that objection. It's just, this is what we mean by depth. This is really good. And again, showing good knowledge of the literature. Hursthouse here is writing not about utilitarianism, but about a different part of philosophy, virtue ethics. The student knows their stuff because they've seen how they could bring this in to make a point, and they've said, okay, this is a good point, but I'm not going to pursue it further here because I don't have the space or I don't have the resources to do so. Reflective, thoughtful, excellent work. Second objection, so this objection has turned out not to be something that the student can pursue. Second objection is phrased here with tremendous care. The student here introduces this sort of quasi-mathematical language. That's not necessary. It's fine, there's no problem with it. If you can think of catchy English ways of expressing what's expressed here in maths, that's great. They've introduced the maths here, I think, just because the ideas are getting a little bit complicated and long-winded to express. You can use this shorthand mathematical or any shorthand English way of speaking about it that you like. The idea here is original. The student hasn't made very clear that it's original, but it clearly is. It's good. After I thought about it for about 10 minutes, I decided that it probably doesn't work, but that doesn't matter. It's not about whether I agree with your essay as a marker. It's about whether you've done the work of providing a good argument, of getting into depth, whether you've understood the basics, whether you've drawn in the stuff from the literature that's relevant. And this argument really is quite well done. They've noticed the limits of the argument. They've compared it to other arguments, very briefly, admittedly. But all in all, it's precise, it's well argued, and the problem with it is extremely subtle, if there's a problem at all. You can check out this essay, we'll launch it on Moodle or something like that, and you can read through the argument for yourself and spend some time thinking about whether you think it's persuasive. Here, we've got the conclusion. The conclusion is just saying what the essay said. It's summarizing it, but because loads of tools and ideas have been introduced along the way, and now the reader's familiar with a bunch of ideas, the conclusion can say what the point is, the argument is in more depth, with more precision. And it's, again, well done, right? So this is kind of just the introduction in the past tense. The introduction says, here's what I'm going to show, here's how I'm going to show it. But the conclusion says the same content, but It's addressing it in a more precise way, and sheds more light on it, really. Now we've got a bibliography here. Everything's in order. It's all done in a systematic way. It's all clear. I could easily work out how to go and read Hursthouse. Just search for On Virtue Ethics. It's apparently published by Oxford in 1999. Overall, this essay is really good. Clear thesis, controversial, interesting, clearly argued for. The argument shows a good understanding of the literature, not because it's repeating the literature, but because it's drawing it in where it's relevant. The argument considers objections to itself and responds to those objections, and even objects to those responses and responds to those objections again. It's got that tremendous amount of depth. This is one point pursued with great depth. There's originality, and the originality is showing mastery, showing that the student really has a very firm grasp of what Railton's point is and what utilitarianism is. The structure's clear, the writing's clear. This is an outstanding essay. It has problems. The definitions aren't as sharp as they could be. I think there's probably an objection to this final point here that should have been considered if you had space. But it's very good. So this is a mid outstanding. It's going to be around 95. That's it. I hope that was helpful. Do check out our other video, where we mark an essay that's considerably worse than this, and you'll be able to get some sort of idea of what goes wrong and what goes right in essays. Hope it was helpful. Thanks. Bye.